Mr. Chair, we are in public session.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I apologize for the somewhat late start. It's, first of all, a pleasure to welcome everybody to New York City. For those who haven't been here for having meetings yet, I think this is at least my first go-round in this space, which is a much bigger space than we're used to having in New York, so thank you to everybody for arranging that. So we've got an ambitious agenda, as always. Let's get right to it. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the public session from the April 25th meeting. Is there a motion? Thank you, Commissioner. Second? Thank you.
Commissioners McAuliffe and Jacob.
All in favor?
New York City, all votes in favor.
Same with Albany.
I see
Okay.
Commissioner Renzi's hand.
Ramsey had his hand.
Yeah,
up.
but does
Yeah,
anyone see
okay.
Commissioner Levine?
I get excused.
Is that unanimous? It looks that way.
Okay.
By the way, how many commissioners do we have? We have
We
10.
have 10, so
All right.
we have 8 for a quorum, so we have 10 present
All right.
under the rules.
All right, next item, which is number 3 on our agenda here, report from staff.
I can run through that, Mr. Chairman. The 2016 financial disclosure statements filed pursuant to 73A of the Public Officers Law, they've been filed. They've been processed. I believe the statewide, they're on the website, so they are available on the website. I think things went fairly smoothly in terms of our own dealing with filings, so we're ready on that. Update on outreach activities. Our education group did a very big training for the Public Service Commission, as a matter of fact, which I understand was very successful, and they got very good reviews. It's part of our outreach to each agency, trying to adjust the training to the peculiar or particular needs of the agency and the problems that they may arise, and being in a position to better address them in that fashion. So I understand that went very well. Also in the area of outreach, October 26th, in conjunction with New York Law School, we are putting together panels, and the staff here will be conducting a CLE program on public ethics. It should be 3 credits. I'm not sure if it's in the morning or the afternoon. It's the afternoon. Pepe's been sort of the lead on all of that, so she's been working very hard to put that together, and we hope to have a program that we can present to stakeholders and to government, folks in government as well. In conjunction with that, we are, and by the way, there'll be 3 CLE credits going along with that, which is even nicer. We're also putting together a book in conjunction with New York Law School and New York City Law, is it called the?
Center for New York City Law.
Center for New York City Law, that Pepe's been editing. We've had staff writing chapters, and it's going to be a handy 1-volume work on New York's ethics and lobbying laws. There's a comparable volume that has been put out by the Conflict of Interest Board in the city, and we're putting out a similar volume, spending free time and other time putting together those chapters. So we hope to have that for the October presentation as well.
The CLE credit is focused only on ethics?
It's going to be ethics and we're doing investigations, and we're doing another topic as well.
Post-employment.
Post-employment.
But,
it'll
so
be
it
3
isn't
ethics
only
credits.
going to be ethics?
Yes,
You mean
it
it'll
is.
be 3 ethics credits?
Yes.
That's correct. 3 ethics credits you need 4 ethics credits in a
Right,
cycle. So
right.
this is a very
Right.
good.
The
The reason I ask is because the program's going to deal with lobbying.
No,
Oh, it is not?
it's not. It's going to be simply ethics. We're going to have
Just
3 parts.
ethics.
The first hour will be a general discussion. We're going to have a second hour on the investigation aspect of dealing with ethics issues, and the third is going to be on post-employment restrictions.
The city does an annual ethics conference, and we're hoping to be able to work on something like that. And so we're starting with the 3-hour program, working also with city law.
Great.
And if it goes well, then we may try and do this on a regular basis and maybe have one up in Albany. This is our first effort. We wanted to start, based on city law's recommendations, we were starting in New York City and with the half-day program.
So it's a start for the agency, but it's something that certainly helps fulfill our education mission and actually forces all of us to do really deep dives into material as well. So I think it educates staff, it's going to educate the public, and will be a very useful session. And as that develops, we'll keep you up to date on further details. Update on annual report. A draft was circulated last week for comments. The goal would be to get it out by the end of the week here, if we could. So if there are comments, please let us know what those comments are, and we'll incorporate them. But the goal would be to make it as timely as possible, so certainly getting it out before the end of May. Before I talk, well, I'll let Monica talk about what we're doing with our office space in New York City. Just as a legislative note, there was a bill that was brought to our attention, actually by DOB. It's Senate 919, Assembly 6003. What the bill would expand JCOPE's training obligations and the LECs, but JCOPE's in particular, to provide live training on a yearly basis to every possible state employee. We were asked to work on a budget estimate about what that would do to our budget, and in terms of hiring, I'm not sure how many hundreds of thousands, how many people did we say that would, an additional,
Well, right
how many
now,
people?
our mandatory training program by statute covers FDS filers, which is about 25,000 state officers and employees. To cover all state employees would bring in over 200,000 officers and employees. And in addition, our current mandatory training program is approximately every 3 years for the 25,000. This would be every year, and it has to have a live component, like the executive director said. So it's a much bigger burden. And what did we estimate?
Almost $2 million. It's almost $2 million. We would need to hire maybe a dozen new trainers, because we would have people simply doing training all year long. We're not commenting, obviously, on the merits of it. We're just dealing with the practical issues of implementation. Should the legislature go in this direction, the Senate has passed the bill in the past. This year there is an assembly sponsor. In addition to our other legislative monitoring, we're monitoring this bill as well. But we were asked for some input, and from a fiscal standpoint, and that input was supplied. You want to do office space?
I wanted to update the commission. So the lease on the New York space, I believe, has about 2 more years on it, and as part of the regular lease renewal process, the Office of General Services starts about 2 years early looking for alternative space. They have a regular program on how they do this. They hire outside brokers and consultants. As you know, our space is in a private building, which is several different state agencies in it. So they will be looking for not only a new space to house everyone, as well as individual spaces that might better suit our needs. They're also going to continue to consider keeping us in our current space. But we've asked that they expand the size of the space that we have, so that we can have more staff in New York City and also have access to 2 large conference rooms. So a larger conference room than we currently have, which we use for internal meetings and investigations, and then as well we'd like access to a hearing room that we can also use for trainings that has all the technological capabilities, so that we can do training statewide very easily, and so it has to have public access. So they've begun that process, and we'll keep you posted as if they find new space or they look into expanding our current space. But this is part of a regular program, and it takes a while. So I think that they estimated that we would know about what space it might be in about a year. And then it takes a while to complete the lease negotiations. But it's done publicly, there are RFPs, and it's a very long, drawn-out process. They were also doing the same up in Albany, but in Albany we have no request to expand. So we're hoping that we can keep our current space.
Okay, item 4, regulations.
I'm going to let Martin take the lead on that, but just to give some background and remind folks where we are. This would be the last substantive presentation, walking the commission through the staff draft. Our goal would be, at this point, before the next meeting, and I don't mean in the book, I mean hopefully within the next couple of weeks, to take a final set of comments, give that to the commissioners in a red-line version based on the draft you've been looking at. We've been incorporating the input we've gotten from you and from a variety of other groups and individuals, and present those to the commission in June with the idea of actually commencing the SAPA process, which, as you know, is another process of gathering public input, airing ideas, and once again doing something perhaps a little more formal than we've been doing now, but certainly as comprehensive. We would go through that process, which takes, depending on when those regulations make the state register, about 45 days. If there are other comments that go in, that process will be extended. But the idea would be to have these aired publicly, starting in June, if the commission would like to start that process. As part of that review, based on input we have gotten, is we'd like to do another public hearing in Albany. We have a number of the stakeholders and some of the other advocacy groups have asked to further comment, and I think it's good for the SAPA process to allow that kind of comment in an open atmosphere. And so the thought would be perhaps sometime in August, obtaining a hearing room, which is not that difficult to get in Albany during the summer, assuming the legislature is not in session, and God willing, they will not be in session, and having a public hearing again based on this revised draft. Once again, this is a process of getting different iterations out there, trying to get comments, trying to get people comfortable with what we're doing. So I think that will add to it. So that would be the plan. Last presentation by Martin today. We'll have something for you to look at well in advance of the next meeting. And then, you know, it's certainly within your discretion to start the SAPA process. But once again, that's not a final process. That's, once again, getting those iterations so we get a very good set of regulations out there. Martin is going to present on a number of the issues that we haven't touched on, and I'll let him start.
Okay. Thank you, Seth. As Seth mentioned, this is the last of the I'll call them long-form presentations that I'm going to do on the regulations. However, when we go through the rulemaking process, if that's the direction you want to go, obviously there will be ample opportunity to discuss comments that are received and any other issues that may have cropped up since we first issued this draft last summer. I want to cover 3 topics today: client filings, source of funding reporting, and what's called a contingent retainer prohibition. I'm going to start with contingent retainers. I think that's a good topic to get knocked out early. But before I start, it's worth noting that there's a central theme in all of these topics today, and that is the difference between the contractual client and the beneficial client in a lobbying effort, and the different roles and responsibilities that each have as part of engaging in lobbying. And just to restate for the umpteenth time, the contractual client is the party with privity of contract with the lobbyist, while the beneficial client, which may or may not be the same entity, is the intended specific beneficiary of the lobbying effort. In most cases, they are the same entity, but in the event they're not, we want to lay out what the responsibilities are for each. So, contingent retainers. In Section 1K of the Lobbying Act, there's a prohibition on any lobbyist receiving or any client paying a retainer in which the amount of compensation is contingent in whole or in part on the outcome of legislation, executive orders, procurements, gaming compacts, rulemakings, regulations, any government action that's taking place. The retainer to the lobbyist cannot be contingent on the outcome of that government action. Obviously, this prevents the sort of incentive structure from developing that might encourage one to engage in untoward activity. This is not unique to New York. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, there are 43 states that have enacted a prohibition on contingent retainers, and there are 2 others that have sort of a reporting requirement associated with that. This is going to ring familiar, or at least it should, in that we talked about commissioned salespersons a couple of months ago as a group that is exempt from the contingent retainer prohibition because of the nature of what they do. So the lobbying regulations, it actually is not covered in the current draft, but will be in the draft you receive hopefully next month, are going to spell out that the contingent retainer prohibition applies to both the contractual client and the beneficial client. And what we're going for here is that anybody who's involved in a lobbying relationship, whether you are paying the fee, hiring someone to get you a lobbyist, a member of a coalition that is engaging in lobbying, you are responsible for obeying the lobbying rules, the prohibitions on gifts, the prohibitions on contingent retainers, and that there shouldn't be a way around these things by engaging an intermediary. So that's the principle behind applying this to both parties. There is one specific context that I want to talk about that comes up. There's an opinion of our predecessor 17 years ago that talked about when a lobbyist is paid in the stock of his client. Is that equity share a contingent retainer? The Temporary Commission on Lobbying found that it was a per se violation of the contingent retainer prohibition because they found that the value of the stock would change based on the outcome of the lobbying activity. So for the past 17 years, the precedent has been that this practice of paying in stock is disallowed. As part of the regulatory process, we have revisited this question and a number of others. And from a staff perspective, we think there's refinement from that position that can be made. There are innumerable factors that influence the value of a stock. And I think to say that a lobbying effort, without an exploration of how substantial or large the lobbying effort is, how big the company is, to say that that will definitely and directly change the value of the stock, I think ignores the externalities that occur in the markets every day. And I think it's kind of a blunt instrument where you can be more refined in applying this rule. So the regulations are going to provide that a payment in equity to a lobbyist will be presumed impermissible but not overcome. Will be able to overcome that presumption with a showing that the stock is not directly dependent on the outcome of the government action. And a couple of factors so that we can establish a standard that everyone can rely on. The factors that we're going to look to are whether the stock is currently publicly traded or whether it's a closely held corporation. Whether the lobbying is about a firm's access to a market as a whole. Is this a geographic restriction where a location does not permit a sort of activity that a company is trying to relocate to? Is this a access to a market through a product that is currently restricted? Another factor is whether the government action is specific to one or two players in a market or whether it is crossing an industry as a whole. And then the Commission may find from time to time that there are other factors relevant to this analysis. But we feel like this is a way of revisiting that opinion and providing some nuance to it. It may result in the same outcome, it may not, but we think this is a practice that can, if it's permissible, can provide smaller startup firms a way to engage in lobbying where they may be, cash poor at the beginning, where they can get access to this service where they might not otherwise. But it's going to be a case-by-case based on this standard. All right, so that's the first topic, contingent retainers. I'm going to move on to client filings. As a reminder, clients file a report twice a year that disclose all their lobbying activity for all their lobbyists. In comparison, a lobbyist files one report for each of his clients every 2 months, each of her clients. So in applying the client filing requirements, we want to figure out what the responsibilities are for the contractual client and the beneficial client. So we're establishing a clear rule, or at least we hope it's a clear rule, that is based on two premises. One, the contractual client is responsible for filing the semi-annual report. If there's a party with privity of contract to the lobbyist, that party is responsible for the paperwork. If it's the same party, then it doesn't matter. It's the same responsibility. The second rule is that is the intended beneficiary of the lobbying, regardless of who's in contract, is responsible for disclosing sources of funding. And this prevents an entity from engaging an intermediary as a means of stepping back from source of funding reporting. So if you are a beneficial client, you are a client. Clients are responsible for filing semi-annual reports and source of funding. We're saying if the client is two parties, these are their respective responsibilities. That's it. That's the rule. What I think is that this way of assigning duties allows for the presence in the market of companies that provide an administrative or brokerage service to clients, where clients can come to a central vendor and say, find me a lobbyist and handle the paperwork and handle the engagement agreement. And that allows these parties to exist and continue to provide a service and do the paperwork for their clients. However, when it comes to disclosing sources of funding for a lobbying effort, we're not interested in the intermediary. We're not interested in the broker. We're interested in the beneficial client. And so this rule applies that obligation to the party who bears the benefit or absorbs the benefit of the lobbying activity.
And we do have companies that do that as a business plan.
Absolutely.
That engage.
And we're not trying to infringe on that business activity. We're trying to accommodate it while still meeting the public policy goals of source of funding. But we are going to talk about source of funding separately. I just want to point out the implication of the rule.
So in each instance, the beneficiary you speak of now is responsible for disclosing sources, meaning the contractual entity is not?
That would be the rule, that the contractual entity. Now, if they're the same.
I'm talking where there's a contractual and a beneficiary.
Yes.
So it is either one or the other.
Yes.
It is never both, unless they are the same.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
We want a clear demarcation of the responsibilities. Obviously, there are going to be permutations when you get into cases of joint lobbying efforts, but we can talk about that when it comes to source of funding. So just a reminder also that this source of funding requirement only applies if you meet the $15,000 spending threshold, and that's 3% of your expenditures. We're not saying if you are a client or a beneficial client that you automatically have to disclose your sources. We're saying that that spending that you engage in through the lobbyist, through the intermediary, counts towards your source of funding threshold. So a small group that makes a small contribution to a collection of, aggregation of like-minded small groups, when none of them meet the $15,000 threshold, are not going to have to disclose their sources. They're just going to have to keep track of that money, and they may have an obligation. The second point about client filings that I want to talk about is over the years we have gotten feedback from the regulated community that there are often cases where clients are filing one report as a lobbyist and another report as a client. So they engage in lobbying on their own behalf. They have in-house lobbying staff. So they're required to register as a lobbyist on behalf of client themselves. And currently they're required to file both sets of reports. What we're saying is if your only lobbying activity is going to be through in-house lobbying, then you can simply file every 2 months as a lobbyist, file your registration every 2 years. You don't have to redisclose that same activity in a client report. I think this will be an administrative ease create some ease for the filers, eliminate some administrative burden for JCOPE, but really this is about eliminating duplicative processes. The same information is being reported, and the information is being reported on the more frequent basis. So it's coming every 2 months instead of every 6. The second issue is we are clarifying that a client who files a report in July for the first half of the year but hasn't yet hit the $5,000 threshold and then comes to the end of the year and they still haven't hit the threshold is not responsible for filing that second report because in actuality they never reached the threshold. So those are two things we think will provide some flexibility for the regulated community. So that's client filings, at least in terms of the big issues that I wanted to hit for the Commission. Turning to source of funding, which I think will be the meat of today's discussion.
Can I return to one thing you mentioned?
Yes.
May I?
Go ahead.
These small entities that you describe, none of whom exceed the requisite amount, but in the aggregate, they may be spending $100,000
Sure.
as beneficiaries in the aggregate,
Yes.
lobbying for the same purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that nobody is required, not a single one of them is required to make a disclosure?
So here's how that would work. There's a couple of layers. The first is, as we talked about last month when we talked about coalitions.
Right. That's
said
why
that-
I ask you.
Yeah, exactly. There's a principle that a coalition can register as a coalition, disclosing all of its activity in one place, or the individual members, in the alternative, they can't be mixed and matched, the individual members can disclose their activity on their own filings. Obviously, you raise a point. What if those members don't rise to the threshold individually, but the group itself as a whole does? That does create a scenario where there is potential for disclosure of certain activities by a group that spends less than $5,000.
It creates the potential of no disclosure,
Yes. Yes.
not disclosure, no disclosure whatsoever.
Uh,
Yet in the aggregate,
Understood. So what we've said is we've refined that coalition definition and said if a coalition comes together for the primary purpose of simply engaging in lobbying as a joint effort for aggregating its funds, then those contributions by the members of the coalitions count toward their own source of funding, even if they don't even...
okay, that's what we discussed last time on coalitions, and I saw your amendment, which means it's being, what your answer is you're capturing the concept in the coalition approach. You would have to call this group a coalition. They may not call themselves a coalition,
Yeah?
but we would call them a coalition if they were all on the same wavelength, lobbying. Is that what you're saying? If they were all lobbying for the same objective, they don't call themselves a coalition
I
to
understand.
accomplish X. I assume we would call them that. So each, under your amendment, your current amendment, as per last month's discussion, each member of the coalition would report. That's what you say in your current amendment.
Yes.
I mean, but
no,
bottom
and I
line, where do we
acknowledge-
capture this?
I think your point is well taken. And it does create a scenario where these groups that are each individually spending less than the threshold would require them to register individually. And you have to make a policy decision of whether that's important enough for disclosure. If you say it is, one way to address that is that in the event, and we can put this in the regs, and this is a good solution, I think, in the event a coalition decides not to register as a coalition and no single member would be required to file, maybe then we can say that the coalition registration is required.
Okay,
As long
this
as
is
no
what
single-
That's your question.
because you have a lot of clever lawyers out there who practice lobbying. And the first thing you're going to find out is that somebody understands that if everyone stays at 4,900 and you accumulate hundreds of thousands of dollars in a lobbying effort and nobody files a piece of paper, nobody knows who's behind the effort.
Like I said, you can approach it two ways. You can say, one, this is a lot of spending of a very little amount of money.
Yes.
And if that's the case, you could say, we are potentially not going to capture that. Or you can address it and say, if no member is required to file, then the coalition must file it together.
But the spirit of the law is transparency.
I agree.
If we don't
And-
get to achieve transparency because we defeat it with regulations,
I don't disagree with you at all. What I think is that it's very unlikely in that scenario, but I'm happy to spell it out. that
it's not in there now.
Correct.
Okay. Because your amendment on the coalition didn't cover that.
That's correct.
Okay.
But I'm happy to make that amendment, and I think it's within the spirit, and in the event it occurs, we've covered it.
Okay.
If it looks like it's lobbying and acts like it's lobbying, then it's
Exactly.
lobbying.
Exactly.
All right.
I just have one quick comment, more of a point to ponder on the contingent retainers with respect to payment in stock.
Sure.
And you don't even need a response right now, but just, I guess, something to consider. Is that perhaps the presumption should be reversed, that if the goal, it seems to me, as you correctly stated, that the payment in stock would probably most be applicable to small startups. And I think most lawyers seeing a presumption against a payment in stock would probably advise their clients as a startup not to go down that road. So I don't know if you're going to be effectuating a more liberal or nuanced application of the law if you have the presumption that it's prohibited, but if you switch the presumption, you might effectuate the goal of having a more modern day kind of comprehensive approach to it. Anyway, just a point to ponder.
Thank you. And it does create a tension between the goal of not allowing anything that's contingent on the outcome, and especially at a small company, which might be at a make-or-break stage, it might be more contingent on the outcome. So it's always a balancing act.
If you use the presumption the other way, Robert, you're taking the current position, which prohibits stock as a contingency, and you create a presumption that says it's completely lawful. So you're 180 from where you are today. If you use the presumption, but you create standards which ease the way for the small startups, when you create standards, they almost speak for themselves for a small startup. But to move away from what is prohibited to something that becomes presumptively lawful is a far reach, I think.
I understand it's a substantial change. I'm just not, if the goal is to make some change at all, I just think having it be presumptively prohibited will probably not effectuate any real world change whatsoever.
Well, if we tinker with those standards, we might be able to achieve it. Let's see what the standards look like.
That's a great point, and we do want to be
I don't
able
disagree.
We want them to have
tinker
impact.
with the standards.
Okay.
That's a good point.
All right.
Somebody can always request an advisory opinion anyways.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a good point.
And if there's a standard there, then we get reviewed like any other administrative agency,
Right.
which is the beauty of having that standard placed in
Exactly.
there. So exactly right.
I just want to point out before we get further into source of funding that throughout these presentations, we've been talking about this draft 942 set of regulations. Just a reminder, source of funding was a pre-existing set of regulations at Part 938 of Title 19 of the Code and Rules and Regulations. So as a matter of mechanics, we have approached this as an amendment to the existing Part 938. So with that said, the biggest change, and the one that is going to generate, I think, the most consternation and valid debate, is that this idea of assigning source of funding responsibility to the beneficial client. It's never been done before. All we've ever had is a third-party disclosure when a lobbyist is engaged by a client through an intermediary. That client has been disclosed. What we're saying now very clearly and with a bright line is that party has responsibilities to disclose its sources. I think it's a clarifying point, and it's good public, in my opinion, it's good public policy, but it is going to generate, I think, a substantial amount of debate.
Lost the screen.
As we also mentioned, when those coalitions are created for the primary purpose of lobbying, and we're not talking about trade associations, we're not talking about 501c5s, but when they are created just to come together to engage in lobbying, those contributions are imputed back to the members, not to the coalition for source of funding. This prevents the creation of a straw coalition as a means of putting a layer between sources and the client. As I said, 501c5s and 6s would not be captured by this rule, so their disclosure would continue to be their members. And there's provisions in the statute that address the membership contributions and how they're disclosed. Keep in mind that a group that comes together to engage in lobbying and, say, make political contributions would not be overcoming that idea of coming together just for lobbying, because political contributions will go hand in hand with that activity, and we don't want to say that that's a way of getting around it, just to be clear. So there is...
By the way, you mean when the coalition itself makes a contribution, when this group
Yes.
makes itself, per se, makes a contribution under...
Right. We want to create a difference between a group that comes together to engage in lobbying where they would have and could have just spent that money individually. But by coming together as a group, it shouldn't act as a barrier to disclosure. As opposed to a group that comes together and engages in education for its member and other services, it is a legitimate entity that stands there that may engage in lobbying, but should be able to register as such and not pass that source of funding back to its donors. A question has come up at a staff level as to whether an equity owner, again, we're dealing with stock here, an equity owner of an entity must be disclosed as a source of funding. It's an interesting question. There's obviously arguments. When it's used legitimately, there are arguments both ways as to whether you should consider someone who makes an investment in a firm the same as a contributor to a typical not-for-profit and gets disclosed in current source of funding. What we think is the proper way to handle this is to say, again, with the same $15,000 and 3% of your total expenditures, with that threshold in mind, we say that equity owners would be disclosable as sources unless the firm is publicly traded, because then you're capturing a whole world you don't want to capture for source of funding. I absolutely don't want to get to a point where a publicly traded corporation is required to disclose its shareholders to JCOPE. It has no bearing on their funding of lobbying individually. I think this will generate a lot of debate as well. But keeping in mind that that threshold of 3% of total expenditures is there, I'm hoping that it doesn't become a substantial barrier in corporate activities. But that's why we put these out and see what the feedback is. But I'd rather highlight it and clarify it than not address it.
And this has no bearing at all about the current litigation that's being, in terms of source of funding and the challenges to the amendment to the executive laws.
I know it makes no change to who is required to file.
Right.
It's what happens once you're required to file.
Right.
The last change that is proposed in the draft.
Give a clearer example of what you mean. An LLP. Work
I'm
with
sorry.
an LLP for a moment.
Okay.
An LLP, they're a partner,
Yes.
okay? And the thresholds are met. The LLP files and discloses, okay? Who besides the LLP entity must disclose under your version?
Well, the current statute says, and the current regulations say, that they must disclose all sources of funding who contribute more than $2,500 in a year. There is an exclusion in the regulations that provides that payments for goods and services does not make you a source. So when you buy a product from a company, as a customer, you are not a source. So the question came up, when you invest in a company, when you put your capital into a limited partnership, are you now a source? Are you getting a good or a service back? And there's an argument that you are getting a good back. But there's also a potential for the creation of corporate entities for the purpose of escaping source of funding reporting.
Yeah.
So we think this balances it, but I think...
But in the example I gave you, can I create an entity with 2 or 3 shareholders, and the entity meets the thresholds,
Yes.
and just file and disclose the entity without the owners of the entity?
Well, I think what we're saying here is no. We're saying that you would be required.
Okay. You would be required.
Yes. But we're
Not
anxious for
not a
feedback on
public
this.
corporation. You're right. If the corporation were public, and especially if it were a filing entity for securities laws, there'd just be hundreds, thousands.
Absolutely. I have no.
We're not going there.
Not at all. But we'll see what the feedback is.
But this applies to clients, not
Gotta
to
walk straight into
lobbying
that
firms that
problem.
are hired, correct?
No,
Is this
it's
just
clients and entities that engage in their own lobbying.
Exactly.
Okay. The last point that I wanted to highlight is in the draft of the source of funding regulations that you have, there's a strike through in the section on exemptions from disclosing your sources. And the strike through is the terms substantial likelihood and clear and convincing when you're dealing with the request for individual exemptions, exemptions for one single source at a time, as opposed to a blanket exemption. The reason those strike-throughs were put in was to ensure that the regulation is completely and totally conforming to the statutory language. Whether or not the regulation should differ in some way is a completely different discussion, but I wanted to put forth why it was drafted the way it was to make it conforming to the statute. But beyond that, it was not a recommendation on staff's part as far as how the standard should be addressed.
Right, and just to remind you, we've previously changed the blanket exemptions to conform to the statutory language, so this is an opportunity to conform the individual exemption to the statutory language.
That's all I have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
New and other business. We have none. Okay.
That's the commissioner.
So with that, we need a motion to enter into executive session.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you, Commissioner. We have
Commissioner Jacob, just.
Jacob and McCall. All in favor?
We have everyone in New York City.
And I see.
Everyone WebEx
Everyone is webbing, so that's
in
Commissioners
Albany.
Okay,
Renzi
yeah.
and.
Okay, that's
Levon.
unanimous. Thank you, everyone.
All right, Wolf, we're going into.
Mr. Chair, we're back in public session.
Thank you. Today, in executive session, we did the following. We approved 2 settlements. We commenced an investigation. We discussed several investigative matters, approved an application under 73(8)B, and issued an advisory opinion. That is all. Now we're adjourned until,
We need a motion.
oh, we need a motion. I'm sorry. Again.
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Jacob. Second, Commissioner McAuliffe. Thank you. All in favor of adjourning?
New York City in favor?
Any opposed? Okay, we stand in adjournment.
Well done.